Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar centres around an LCA comparing the environmental performance of Tetra Pak cartons to a range of competitive packaging options that were available in Australia and New Zealand. Unfortunately, Vikas' camera was disabled, but this definitely did not take away from the webinar's content. Here's a sneak preview.
So we actually purchased more than 100 products off the shelf in both Australia and New Zealand.
It was really important for us to make sure that our QA, or the standards we followed, gave a comparison of different packaging materials that was absolutely bulletproof.
The other key takeout for me is that not everything that is circular is low carbon and vice versa. But when you talk about the impact of climate change, then that's when it starts really resonating with consumers. Everyone.
Yeah, I think recycling is an important thing for us to be doing as a society, and it's important for us to be moving towards a circular economy. But I do think that when you focus on it by itself, you miss the bigger picture. So we went conservative again. For the Tetra Pak recycling rate, we assume 90% landfill, 10% recycling.
We've just signed contracts for a new dedicated Tetra Pak recycler for New Zealand.
The speakers go into what the study found out, in particular what packaging material had the lowest carbon footprint and was something I found surprising. However, which option was it? Let's find out.
Welcome to the webinar today, which is called The Proof is in the Data, Packaging Lifecycle Assessment Study for Tetra Pak. My name is Jeff Vickers, and I'm the Technical Director from thinkstep-anz. It's a pleasure to have you along today for this webinar and our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 minutes. We'll be keeping today's webinar short, as we always do, to a 30-minute slot. And I'm delighted to welcome along our two guest speakers today, both from Tetra Pak. I have with us Jaymie Pagdato, who's the Marketing Director from Tetra Pak Oceania, and Vikas Ahuja, the Sustainability Director from Tetra Pak Oceania. So welcome to you both to today's webinar. For the first part, we'll just go through and we'll have a conversation amongst the three of us. Hopefully it's of interest to you. And we'll discuss Tetra Pak's recent life cycle assessment study. I'd like to kind of get the conversation started. And I'd like to hand over to Jaymie and ask if you could tell us why you chose to do this life cycle assessment study and what you were hoping to achieve.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. So capping carbon footprint is one of the key pillars of sustainability priorities for Tetra Pak. And we have been doing life cycle assessments globally, mostly in Europe and in the US. So the company is not new to such type of assessment. And in capping carbon footprint, the analysis is one of the important ways to assess and measure, how we are going against that target. So while it has been done in other parts of the world, we really wanted to pressure test that and make sure that the data that we are checking for Oceania is really valid in the local setting, so across Australia and New Zealand. So that's one. The second reason is that a lot of these carbon assessments are done on a singular packaging format. What we wanted to do was to actually test the variety of packaging formats that exist in the market across Australia and New Zealand, and also across a number of categories that consumers are buying into. So I think in our earlier engagement with you, Jeff, one of the most critical decisions that we had to do at the start was really looking at the scope of the study. So maybe you can share with the audience here, how we went about, going through the scope and confirming that.
Yeah, thanks, Jaymie. So, as part of this, as Jaymie was kind of indicating, we want to make this quite real world. So to make it very specific to Australia and New Zealand, but also specific to the types of products that people actually purchase. And so we looked at a whole range of different pack formats available in Australia and New Zealand off supermarket shelves to try and work out what was kind of there. And so we're looking at product categories that, can, suit beverage packaging and in some cases food as well. And we're looking at the range of different packs available on the market. So we didn't come in with a sort of predefined idea of what we wanted to compare. Rather, we were looking at, let's try and capture the full variety of the packs that are in the market at the time the study was starting, which was in late 2019. And so these are the packs that we covered, the cartons, but while I've got Tetra Pak here, we covered Tetra Pak and other cartons from all brands. We covered PET bottles, recycled PET, HDPE bottles, pouches, cans of both aluminium and tin-plated steel, glass, and in format of jars and bottles. And the reason why there's a wide range of packs here is we covered a series of different pack of product categories. So we covered long life milk, fresh milk, juice, water, and retorted food. And so what we were trying to do is to capture the variety of packs in Australasia. So we did cover a wide range of size classes from 200 ml right up to 2 litres. And we tried to capture all the packaging layers as well. So we're looking not only at the pack itself, but also how the pack gets to the supermarket, whether that's in a shipper carton or in a reusable plastic age crate, or in any other particular format. Sometimes you get plastic bottles that are wrapped in just shrink wrap, and maybe they've got a little carton base or whatever it happens to be, and they're stacked on top of each other. And then what are the pallets that those things are stacked onto to get into the market? And so it was about trying to sort of look at the full packaging system, keeping in mind that there can be some trade-offs. Certain packs are stronger than others, so need more or less secondary packaging, and that changes the way that you perhaps design your entire packaging system. So we're trying to cover that full sort of variety of packs, but also looking at all the different packaging levels, if you like, across a range of size classes. And these, as I say, were ones that were available off the shelf. So we actually purchased more than 100 products off the shelf in both Australia and New Zealand. We pulled them apart, we weighed them, we took out all the contents, dried them, cleaned them, and then weighed them and looked at all the different sort of materials that were used in different quantities so that we could start to get a picture of the packaging market in Australia and New Zealand. And once we did that, we related it to the different life cycle stages and the different inputs needed to actually make the thing. So this is showing the different life cycle stages that we considered. We tried to be as comprehensive as possible. So we covered the sourcing of the raw materials, the manufacture of the raw materials into a finished product, bottle or can or whatever it happens to be, the transport of that pack or raw material to a filling location, the forming of the pack if that's necessary, so if the pack comes flat or if it needs to be extruded or made up on site, any sterilization required for aseptic packaging, because a lot of the pack formats we considered were long life product and so needed some form of sterilization, whether that was aseptic filling or retorting, the filling process itself, and then those downstream stages. So the shippers, the pallets, getting it to store, and then finally the end of life of the packaging. So whether that was recycling, landfill, incineration where it was used, which is very rare in our market, and looking at that per pack format and material type, looking at all the different sort of market statistics that are available for end of life per material type. So that's a sort of broad overview of it, and thanks, Jaymie, for giving me the opportunity to say that. And so with that in mind, I was hoping Vikas could tell us a little bit more about how we ensure that the analysis was accurate and reliable, given that we are making comparisons, and that this analysis is really geared towards quite a few different audiences, so both business to consumer in terms of Tetra Pak's direct customers, business to business in terms of the final consumer, and also, I guess, ultimately regulators in the kind of broader market across Australia and New Zealand. So over to you, Vikas.
Just before I go there, I noticed there was a question come up wanting to know what retorted food is. And it's probably just worth pointing out that often when stuff is canned or bottled or put in a carton, it's kind of cooked after it's gone into the container. And that's typically done in a big vessel called a retort. And so retortable food or retorting food refers to the sort of partial cooking or complete cooking of something after it's been put into its container. Back to your question, Jeff. I think as Jaymie pointed out, the key in some ways was about functional units, was what does a consumer see? And because a consumer's interested in buying a litre of milk, they're not, necessarily choosing a package over another from the outset. It was really important for us to make sure that our QA or the standards we followed gave a comparison of different packaging materials that was absolutely bulletproof. And of course, in dialogue with you, as you know, we followed both the ISO 14044 and the 14067 for life cycle assessment and for product carbon footprinting. But not only that, it was about establishing what international best practice is according to those standards, and then making sure that we followed that. And part of that was, appointing at 2 arm's length from Tetra Pak independent experts who would review the work. And in this instance, they were Rob Rouette, I think you've got them up on the screen, Gordon Robertson and Elspeth McRae, all three people with, great reputations and expertise in this space. And that was really to make sure that the work would stand up to scrutiny. Because we're comparing different packaging formats, it was really important that, we weren't just pushing a beverage carton line. and it was actually a fair comparison of what the consumer receives.
I think your point on functional unit was also really interesting because one point of difference between this study and others that have been done around the world is often life cycle assessment studies have a tendency to relate everything to a single function. So they'll relate everything to, say, 1 litre of beverage delivered. And the challenge with that approach is that you then might have 5 200 ml packs to deliver 1 litre of something. And what we try to do with this study is rather look at the market segments that exist. You know, if you have a litre format, if you have a 600 ml format, if you have a 500 ml format or a 200 ml format, we looked at each of those things as individual units, with the idea being that, you know, you're trying to meet a specific need. And the need might be a single serve, or it might be a multi-serve, or it might be, you know, a take-home pack, like a 2 litre, you know, refrigerated milk or whatever. And so the need being met is quite different. To normalize everything and make it relative to a litre of beverage delivered, we try to stay clear of that approach, because 5 200 ml packs is not really the same as one litre pack. You know, even though they're carrying the same amount of volume, from a market segment perspective, they're quite different. They're trying to meet a very different need. And you would never try and do the same thing with those different options. And so we've tried to avoid that and actually used a whole range of different functional units for both markets based on the products actually available on the market. So it might be a 600 ml, you know, drink product, or it might be a litre of milk product, you know, and so we've tried to choose it on that basis.
That's great. And thanks for the clarification. Of course, the immediate next question is, you know, show us what the results look like.
Well, thank you. I will. So, you know, we looked at a wide range of environmental indicators, but in the context of this study, we prioritized carbon footprint because ultimately climate change is one of the defining issues of our time. Along with biodiversity, they stand alone to me as being the two issues that really are going to define how we live over the next, you know, century. And so we've headlined the carbon footprint results. We've also got a wide range of other environmental indicators that we considered. And we've considered some other metrics, which are not really environmental impact, but which are drivers of environmental impact, which I'll show next, which are around the product to packaging ratio, the amount of plastic per litre of beverage delivered. And so I'll cover that in just a minute. But if we look at the carbon footprint itself, what I'm showing here is a set of results for 1 litre aseptic packaging, taken as an average right across the Australian market and the New Zealand market. And it's broken down into stages. And so you can see here the blue bar, that's the consumer pack itself. And that sort of dominates the environmental profile of all the pack formats that we're looking at here. And we're looking at glass compared to PET, compared to recycled PET, compared to carton. And so what you can see here is that, you know, your consumer pack impacts are very significant. The forming and filling is the small gray bar. It's relatively consistent across the packs. It's a little bit higher for the cartons because you're making them up before you fill them. So there's a little bit more going on there. And then you've got the kind of shipper and pallet, which is secondary and tertiary packaging. You've got distribution, and I should indicate this is distribution of the packaging, not distribution of the product. So this is just to get the pack to market. So you can see here, for example, the glass has got a bit higher distribution impact because it's much heavier than a carton, for example, per litre delivered, but it's still not massively significant in the grand scheme of things. And then finally, you've got the smaller orange bar, which is your end of life, which is either landfill or recycling, or a market average of those two things, depending on the, you know, average kind of collection and recycling rates for each of these different material types in Australia and New Zealand. For the cartons, you can also see this little pink thing, which is popping up in the negative section of the graph. And that's what we're calling the net carbon sequestration. So that's if you imagine a carton is made predominantly from trees, the trees, when they're growing, you know, they're coming from an FSC certified source, so they're a sustainably managed forest. That means they're absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. When they're felled, they're replanted, and the next set of trees absorb that carbon dioxide again. And so effectively that becomes the structure of the carton, a large part of it anyway. There's also a bit of plastic and potentially some aluminium and other things, and there's the cap and whatever else as well. But by and large, there's a lot of paperboard, and that's what makes up the sort of composition of the carton. And then there's also a potential release of some of that information, release of some of that biogenic carbon at the end of life, particularly if the carton goes into landfill, for example, or potentially a release through recycling, where it's kind of artificially released to the next product life cycle. And what you can see there in the pink bar is the difference between those two things. So it's the net amount sequestered over the full life of the product. So if you account for the upstream and the downstream, the net of that, one minus the other, is how much is left. and it results in a net negative number, a net saving. So you're taking a small amount of carbon dioxide out of the air, which results in a slight reduction here. But overall, we're just kind of trying to show the differences here, and this is a slight difference with the carton because it's made from a bio-based material. But what you can see clearly is the cartons perform extremely well. You can see the rPET certainly helps from a PET perspective. Using recycled content is definitely making a difference. We made the assumption that this is locally recycled in both cases. That's not always true. Sometimes the recycled content is imported from other countries. But when you're making a comparison like this, we always try to make what we call the conservative assumption, the best case for the alternatives, because we don't know the supply chains as well as we know the supply chain of the Tetra Pak products. And so we make assumptions that would theoretically favor the alternative packs, just to give them the benefit of the doubt for what's actually happening there, when in reality there might be a combination of domestic recycling and imported recycled content, depending on the pack type you're talking about in the country. So that's the kind of high-level carbon footprint results. But we've also got other results throughout the report looking at lots of different other things. So if we look at product to packaging ratio, in this context, what you're looking at is to package, it's the amount of sort of volume of packaging per gram of product. And so we're looking at, so the massive packaging, massive product volume. We're looking at, in this case, a lower number is worse and a higher number is better. And what you can see is that most of the packs, the PET in New Zealand and Australia, the cartons in Australia and New Zealand, they're all performing pretty well. Glass is not performing quite so well because of its huge sort of weight to deliver the same volume of liquid. Lightweight PET performs well. So that's particularly the lightweight water bottles that you see mainly in Australia, not so much in New Zealand. The ones that if you touch them, they kind of crumple, they're very, very thin wall. That's the most effective way of delivering, say, water in particular. It doesn't really apply for other product categories, but bottled water to consumer. It's got the lowest or the best ratio here, but we've also looked at the carbon footprint of that separately as well, because these numbers, as I say, they don't indicate the impact of something necessarily. They're just a potential driver of impact. If we look at plastic, because one of the big issues for consumers is plastics and products, you can see that in this case, a bigger bar means more plastic, and a smaller bar means less. You can see that the glass products have the least plastic, as you'd probably expect, but it's not zero, because they typically have a plastic label. They might have like a, part of the cap system might include plastic, or for whatever other reason, there's tend to be something. And clearly, your plastic bottles are made of plastic and have a plastic cap. And your cartons have some plastic in them. So, they have some plastic, but it's not far and away from the glass, despite the fact that they're not made of, plastic. So with that in mind, that's kind of like a high level summary of the results. I think from my perspective, what's interesting as a life cycle assessment practitioner is really how these results sort of are relevant from the perspective of a client and what they use them for. And so I wondered, Vikas and Jaymie, if you could talk to us about, what are these results most relevant for you and which ones really stood out for you?
So I'm happy to lead into that if that's okay. And it was really, we kind of knew that cartons are good from a climate impact perspective, but it was great, to have this work done, have it scrutinized in the way it was, and see cartons come out consistently better from a climate impact perspective for all of the categories, all of the sizes that you've referred to, Jeff. And I think the three things that stood out for me in a nutshell that were important was, one, great mass efficiency. So cartons are good because, the mass of the packaging used per unit mass of the product that they encompass, they're really mass efficient, and that helps. Space efficiency. So, I joke about the fact that we have this nerdy brick-shaped package, but actually the nerdy brick-shaped package helps because it stacks together really well, and all those impacts flow through, right? Because then you're not transporting air on a truck, in a carton, in a shipper. You're actually transporting product. So the mass efficiency and space efficiency come to the fore. And then, of course, you talked about it as well, the fact that it's biogenic carbon, the fact that cartons are, somewhere between 69 and 88% plant fiber. In the case of Tetra Pak, 100% plant source material helps drive the low carbon impact. So, for me, it was really nice to crystallize that. And I'll hand over to Jaymie to talk about what that meant.
Yeah, so two key points for me. I mean, recycling, this is where consumers are most passionate about. And, true to the results of the assessment, recycling has a very important role to play. But even more so, the sourcing and the transport of materials. So for me, that's kind of one key takeout from this. And it has to be really looking at the entire value chain if we're talking about really capping carbon footprint. The other key takeout for me is that not everything that is circular is low carbon and vice versa. The concept of reusable being circular may not necessarily be equivalent to something that is low carbon or have a low impact of climate change. And I think it really reinforces, what we're aiming to do, which is aiming at low carbon circular economy. Yeah, those are the two key takeouts from me, Jeff.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, that dual focus, because I think people tend to get focused quite one way or the other. They want to be low carbon or they're thinking circular economy, but they're not necessarily thinking both. And from the perspective of someone who sort of does life cycle assessment and looks at lots of different environmental indicators together, it's important to get that win-win type situation. It's this and this rather than this or this. And I think, when you can achieve both, that's always where you're going to have the best outcome.
That's right.
With that in mind, Jaymie, I wondered what role you thought brand owners could play in lifting the value of life cycle assessment, because I'm aware it is quite technical. It's quite difficult to get into some of these results. What do you think brand owners can really do to help maximize the value of studies like this?
Yeah, the most important, people for the brand owners or the consumers. And I do agree, Jeff, the results can really get quite technical. So it's really about two things, distilling it into relatable and meaningful language. So we regularly conduct sustainability consumer research. And, if you take, for example, carbon footprint, consumers believe that is important, but they're really unable to play back, why it could be compelling. But when you talk about the impact of climate change, then that's when it starts really resonating with consumers. Everyone is seeing and hearing about the bushfires. Our summers getting hotter and longer, our winters getting colder. Everyone can feel and see that. And so I think the key is to effective communication is simple and relatable and meaningful language. But the more important piece is also empowerment. And it's about one piece is education, but the other one is also giving consumers an informed choice about the products that they buy and the package that it is in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great.
So, Jeff, you talked about, actually, Jaymie talked about, the fact that recycling is important. Why don't you tell us a bit about how recycling is accounted for in this way?
Yeah. And so it's a really great question, because recycling is one of these tricky things in life cycle assessment, because there's lots of different ways of handling it. So there's quite a wide range of different methodologies, because effectively what's happening is life cycle assessment is interested in drawing a system boundary around a product. And when you've got multiple life cycles in a chain, it makes it slightly complicated, because you've got multiple system boundaries, if you like, all butting up against each other. And so there's different methods for how you split things up. And the primary results we're showing here use something called the cutoff method. And what that means is that the burden of the recycling process itself is assigned to the life cycle of the product that causes the material to be recycled. So if you use recycled content, you're responsible for the impact of the recycling. But on the downstream side, effectively it's burden free. So it goes to a recycler and there's no impact. So effectively it's like a polluter pays type principle. If you cause the recycling to occur, then you are responsible for that burden of it. But if you pass it off for recycling at the end, then you don't have to account for the burden of that. And the next life cycle accounts for it, to ensure that there's no kind of double counting between life cycles. Whereas if you landfill something, then you're fully responsible for the impact of the landfill, because it's a disposal and there's no multiple life cycle kind of impact. But there are other methods for accounting for recycled content and recycling. And another one that's commonly used is, it's got lots of different names, but it can be called the avoided burden method or the substitution approach, or lots of different things. But it rather looks at the difference between the impact of the primary material and the secondary material, and potentially what the delta between those two things is. How different are they? And so you're kind of avoiding the production of future virgin material by recycling something. And so what is the difference between those two things? And so those two methods are probably the most common, though there are lots. And so in this particular study, we checked both. So in a comparative study like this, if you've got an area of uncertainty, so in this case, a methodological choice, we had to actually test both sets of results to make sure that it wouldn't change our conclusions. And in this case, it didn't. And so if I can just fast forward a few slides here, to the kind of detail here, well, I guess the first thing you can see is that, from a cutoff perspective, the end of life is relatively insignificant. So you can see this orange bar here, and it's not a particularly high sort of number. That's partly because of the fact that a lot of this packaging is inert in landfill, and partly because of the fact that we're using the cutoff method, which means that you don't account for these future recycling credits. So if you do use a different method, so the substitution method, for example, this is where we're going to get really nerdy, so I apologize in advance. But what you can see is like glass here, PET here, lightweight PET, recycled PET. The red dots on these bars, this is the total impact of all the different packs using the cutoff method. The little black triangle is the total using the substitution method with current rates of domestic recycling capability. And the white square is the one using the substitution method, assuming we could recycle everything 100% within Australia or New Zealand. And the reason why we consider two different things is just that the recycling market in both Australia and New Zealand is in a state of flux because of the Chinese national sword. And so historically, both countries used to export a lot of recycled, material for recycling to Asia, to China, Southeast Asia, but that has dramatically fallen off a cliff in the last few years. And there's still some of it happening, but at a much lesser extent, and depends where and how, and the quality of that material. And so we try to look at a range of different things. And what you can see is where the numbers are very close, then effectively you've got no real difference. And so you can see for the cartons, the things are basically laying over the top of each other. So there's no real difference there. For some of the others, the impacts are actually higher. So for rPET, for example, you see the numbers, the impacts actually go up using this methodology rather than down. And the reason for that is because of the fact that you need additional primary virgin PET to substitute for any losses in the chain. So if you've got a bottle that's made from 100% recycled content, which is what we assumed here, which is the best case for recycled PET, you can't get all of it back into a new bottle. And so you've got some loss. And so you need a bit of kind of top-up material. And so what happens then is your credit for the avoided burden of something kind of flips to a burden, an impact, because you need more material to top it up because you've got some loss through the chain. So that's kind of what's happening here. For some of these other things, if you look at glass, you're getting a small improvement if you use the other methodology. And for PET, you're getting improvements as well because of the benefits of recycling. So you do see some slight changes in results, but they're not significant enough to flip the conclusions. The conclusions remain exactly as they were. And that's the purpose of the sensitivity analysis technique, is to try and bring some robustness. So basically what we did is we used recycling statistics available on the market from APCO in Australia and from Wastemans in New Zealand. We applied those across the board. So what percentage of material is being recycled, what percentage is being landfilled. And then we looked at a range of different methodologies to just sort of judge how sensitive our conclusions were to that or not. And in the end, the conclusions hold regardless of what you do. So I hope that answers the question, Vikas.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask a slightly provocative question just because of what these results that you put on screen show. It would seem that some of these results suggest that the current focus on recycling is just shifting the environmental burden somewhere else, or may even be creating a greater environmental burden somewhere else. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think recycling is an important thing for us to be doing as a society, and it's important for us to be moving towards a circular economy. But I do think that when you focus on it by itself, you miss the bigger picture, and life cycle assessment is all about that full product life cycle from cradle to grave. And I think in the context of this, study, it shows that a lot of the burden of a packaging format, for example, and of many products from my experience, is actually the making of the stuff. And I think that sort of part is often missed. People want to deal with waste because it's in their hand, right? You've received some packaging, you've received a product, you've got to dispose of it. And so therefore you're very concerned about how it's disposed of. And that's absolutely fair. But probably more important is that product or packaging or something, how it was made in the first place, and perhaps that it wasn't made in the first place, depending on how that was designed. And I think if you look at something like the waste hierarchy, recycling is further up than landfill, but it's only a couple of steps further up. The top of the waste hierarchy is really around minimization, reuse, avoidance, all of those sorts of things. And so recycling is important, but I think it's not an end in and of itself. It's kind of too late. You've already got the waste, and now you're just trying to work out how you do something a little bit less bad with it, or at least that's the concept. And so for me, it's about taking that holistic view and kind of focusing on what matters most in society. And sometimes that's recycling, but often it's actually the production stuff in the first place.
Yeah, no, our customers have really embraced the results of the life cycle analysis, really confirming the importance of recycling. But also, to your point, Jeff, it's really about having that holistic view and not only looking at the end of life, but even more so, making sure that over 90% of the carbon footprint before the end of life really gets addressed, in their packaging choice or in their sustainability goals. The other good thing is that the LCA has really opened the opportunity to talk about, other sustainable measures as well: water reduction, chemical reduction, waste reduction in the plant. So there's been a really growing interest, amongst customers. The other thing, I think you touched on it, Jeff, is that the brand owners can use this information to really come up with a complete package, if you will. Often brand communication, the brand story is around the product. The LCA can give them an opportunity to also talk about the package and the life, that the cartons, go through before it reaches the consumers. There's an ever-growing awareness and need for education amongst consumers, and it will just continue to do so.
Yeah. Borum asked, he said, thank you for sharing the life cycle assessment details. And this is perhaps a question for Jaymie. What do you think is the best way to communicate the findings to consumers? Do you find that consumers by and large understand this life cycle view versus common perception? So, for example, that glass is often considered having the highest sustainability value to its reuse and recycling. How do you manage that?
Yeah, no, it's really in collaboration with, the brand owners. I mean, consumers buy the brands and connect with the brand. So, the voice of that, as well as, perhaps influencers, around the value of looking at the whole chain and life cycle can be, a powerful tool with consumers. I touched on empowerment and allowing consumers to continue to act on it. And that's why we continue to work on, the solutions for recycling. But when we talk about climate change and all of us, in this together and making sure that we can all contribute to lessening the impact of our food choices, reducing our waste, I think, practical terms like that don't alter consumer behavior will be the most effective way of conveying the message, but also educating them and, establishing a call to action.
Yeah,
around the messages.
There's a question later on about unpacked claims as well. I do think that this is a broader conversation, potentially for a number of the people who are on this call. I think that, people want clear choices and to understand the choices that they're making. And I don't know that our current language is great at presenting them simple enough information to enact those choices. I mean, I look at the common language around cars off the road, number of trees planted, number of flights not taken, but they're not greatly personally relatable.
Yeah.
And I think that, collectively, we need to work towards articulating better to a single consumer, to a single user, to a single householder, what the impact of that choice is to something they can relate to.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's a really great point, because often with sustainability, I think, and particularly climate change, everything falls into the too hard basket. Like it's bigger than me, it's too big, it's too far away from me, it's too global, it's too far removed. And so how you can bring those connections back and make it very personal. Like I like the idea you shared, Vikas, previously of how many days you couldn't use your cell phone for, or how many days you couldn't use your car for. I think all those ideas you shared were really powerful, because they do make it much more personal and much more relatable. And I think closing those feedback loops up is so critical with this kind of information, because it is more difficult. When it comes to recycling, I think the thing is you're holding the pack in your hand. You've got to deal with it then and there, and you've got to make a decision, and it makes it very visible. But for climate change, it's kind of like, well, the fact that there's a lot of whole big supply chain in the forestry industry and plastics industry and aluminium industry and transport and upstream logistics and there's so many things going on, and it can be across multiple countries, and it can be quite invisible. And I think that creating those connections back is so crucial, because otherwise you just lose that connection.
It's also about the touch points, right? Of course, on-pack communication is very important, because it's what gets to the household and the refrigerators and what consumers touch. But it is also, at the path to purchase, what they can see in supermarkets, what they can see outside. And it has to be an industry collaboration to get that effective communication out there.
Mm-hmm. Kelsey and Andrew and a few others have asked about the specific assumptions made around recycling for Tetra Pak cartons. Basically, what we did, just to answer that, it's probably one for me, was regarding, and thanks, Jaymie, for your response. Sorry, I wasn't trying to cut you off. Just moving through the questions. Basically, what we did is we looked at market average data. So we looked at the data from APCO, we looked at the data from Wastemans in New Zealand. We looked at typical recycling rates per material type, so PET, HDPE, etc. Those particular statistics are often missing cartons. They just don't even bother recording them for whatever reason. So we looked at where statistics could be found. So Wastemans do have some for New Zealand. We looked at Tetra Pak does detailed bale audits of actually recycling facilities, and we looked at the figures there. All of the figures that we got for recycling rates were between sort of 15 and 40%. That was the values that we got. The value that we chose for recycling of Tetra Pak cartons was 10%. So we went conservative again. For the Tetra Pak recycling rate, we assume 90% landfill, 10% recycling. The reality is the recycling rate is considerably higher than that, but it depends where you are as to what facilities exist. So we took a kind of conservative approach, and then we used more sensitivity analyses like the one I presented to vary those recycling rates from 0, 10, 80%, and all sorts of different other variables to look at what would happen. And so the report's got all that sort of detail for those who are interested. On the topic of recycling, a few people here, Sandy, a few other anonymous people are asking about recycling of cartons in Australia and New Zealand. And I guess I put that to, to Vikas to answer the curly question about recycling of cartons in the Australasian context.
Yeah, thanks. And I didn't pay any of those people to put that question up. I'm delighted, of course, to be able to announce, and you may have seen this in the media already, we've just signed contracts for a new dedicated Tetra Pak recycler for New Zealand. It's with a company called Saveboard. And of course, we're delighted that a listed New Zealand giant, that's Freightways, has come on board as the largest investor for the recycling operations. So, it's backed by a really key New Zealand company, and we're excited about this. I should say that in the first instance, the cartons that will go into the recycling at this facility is targeted at some pre-consumer materials, so material coming out of the factories of big food and beverage companies like Fonterra, like Frucor, Suntory, like Miraka, like Westland, and in the early stages, probably from Auckland. So Auckland's one of the few councils that still collects cartons in their communal recycling. It gives us a source to tap into, and that's a conversation that's live at the moment. And of course, over time, we would look to grow that collection across the country. But how long that takes is a question of negotiating and a question of volumes coming into collections at the other councils. But yeah, please, look up Saveboard if you want to. I think what they're doing is really exciting. I should have brought a sample. They're making a board product, which is like a chipboard or plywood replacement. And if you think of the fact that a carton is mostly wood fiber, it's compositionally very similar to a chipboard or plywood. And of course, the beauty of turning cartons into a board product is that there's already polymer in the cartons that works as a bonding agent. So there's no water use, there's no added chemicals or resins or additives. So it's a really nice process. And of course, liquid paperboard's designed to keep moisture in and out. So you end up with a board that's really highly moisture resistant as well. So we hope to have this product in the market in New Zealand soon.
That's really exciting. Keith also asked about the Australian context. Vikas, are you able to talk about that?
Yeah, of course. So with this, we're working with the same partners, same technology, and we're busy trying to finalise the deals for Australia that'll bring the same recycling operations into Australia. And it's worth adding at the moment that cartons for most councils, so the 2020 audits for councils were that more than 80% of councils are still accepting chilled and beverage cartons in their recycling. It was 67% for aseptic cartons. Most of them get sorted into a mixed fibre stream, and they're still going to paper mills for the fibre to be recovered and turned back into fibre. Some of the paper mills that we work with across APAC region, across the world, also take the leftover polymer and aluminium and then further recycle that. And that's going back into board products and things like roof tiles.
Great. Thank you, Vikas. There's a question here from Rod about what is the carbon footprint of the product versus the packaging? So how significant is the packaging in the context of this? And do all packs preserve the products the same amount? And so in terms of the second part of that question about the quality of the packaging in terms of preserving the contents of the product, we took functional equivalents based on what was used in market. So if a carton is used or a aseptic PET or whatever is used in market, we judge that as being functionally equivalent. And from every conversation that we had as a group, we kind of felt that these things all would perform at the level, because otherwise brand owners wouldn't be using them, and they're also expected to perform it that way. So from our perspective as a group, all of the packs that we assessed were functionally equivalent over provide similar level of protection of the product. I guess there are some differences for fresh product, but we did consider fresh and aseptic as two separate categories, so that we could look at those two broadly different categories separately. In terms of the carbon footprint of the product itself versus the packaging, it depends hugely what it is. So if it's milk, for example, and you can see the results of 1 litre of milk here, the milk might have a carbon footprint of, say, 1 to 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram. So if you're looking at the glass on the left there, you're talking about getting up towards about 600 grams of, 0.6 of a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram. It's getting close towards the impact of the milk itself. So it's fairly significant, and then the other packs are smaller. It would depend on what you've got in it, right? If it's water, the impact is close to zero of the product, because you're just basically pumping it out of a spring and bottling it. So there's not really a lot of product impact. And in that context, the impact is actually mostly in the packaging. And so it depends heavily what the product is. But typically speaking, for many products, you'd be in the range of kind of like about a kilogram or 2 or 3 or 4 per kilogram of product. And it just sort of depends on what it is. But water is one of those cases where, you don't really have to do a lot to get the thing, it just kind of appears. And so then the impact is much more heavily in the packaging.
Bear in mind, there's the consumer end of the use of the product. So, if I take the water home and stick 24 bottles of water in my fridge because I like it chilled, or, I take the water home and decide I'm going to make my tea out of it and boil it, then that's not accounted for either.
Yeah, true. There are a bunch more questions here about people who like your recycling stuff, Vikas, so maybe I'm just going to ask these. What is the expected start date for the New Zealand Tetra Pak recycling facility?
Yeah, so orders for the equipment were placed pre-Christmas 2020. We expect the equipment to arrive in New Zealand sometime in the second half of 2021. And at the moment, we're working towards a start date for the facility of the back half of 2021. So, October, November, December 2021 is when that facility should be operational.
Thank you very much. And in Australia, do you have any idea of time frame, or is it a bit hard to say at this stage?
So for Australia, we're working towards a facility being operational here by June 30, 2022.
Thank you. Another person asked where the data came from. So that's a great question, and maybe I can take that one. It came from a variety of sources. So for the packs that we got off the shelf, basically what we did is we took a whole range of packs. I think it was about 150 or more in total. We took them back to the office. We emptied them, cleaned them, washed them, dried them so that we'd have just the clean pack. Then we separated all the parts. So we separated the caps from the bottle, from the labels, from whatever else, and we weighed them all independently. We used the recycling labels and information on the packs themselves to indicate what the material types were, or just general knowledge, of what the materials are where they're not labeled. And then we put that into a big database. We also actually purchased cartons off the shelf and weighed them as well. So and that was Tetra Pak and competitor brands of cartons. We purchased them off the shelf too. And then we coupled that with data from Tetra Pak for its specifications. So the different layer thicknesses, the expected product masses. We could use that to test whether our weighing was giving us the appropriate results relative to the specification. All of the data from Tetra Pak's supply chain is based on its real supply chain. So that's based on specific pulp suppliers in Sweden and Brazil, and the process the paper moves through, and where the packs are manufactured, and the energy intensity of that pack manufacture, and all that stuff is all specific to Tetra Pak. For other cartons, we gave them the benefit of the doubt, assumed similar energy intensities, but changed the countries of manufacture. For the other pack types, we basically assumed the most common manufacturing techniques for each. So bottle blow molding, the glass making process, whatever it happens to be, laminate films for pouches, the other things, injection molded caps, etc., etc. So we took generic data for specific manufacturing processes, injection molding, film manufacturing, whatever, and we made that regionally specific to the countries where it was being made. And we used that to reconstruct the supply chain for the competitive pack formats and created a real supply chain for Tetra Pak. And we used sensitivity analysis to test variables. And we tried to assume things that would be conservative, which means benefit the competing pack formats wherever we were uncertain. So, for example, we used 100% recycled content for rPET bottles, despite the fact that some of them are only 50% or 40% rPET. We always went 100 just because that's the highest and therefore lowest carbon footprint. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you, Vikas and Jaymie, again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.